Long before cities shaped the rhythm of Britain, there was another world, quiet, self-contained, and woven from human hands. In the old countryside, life moved to the pace of seasons, not clocks. Every village carried a heartbeat of its own, sustained by people whose skills were so precise, so deeply rooted in their landscape, that no machine could replace them. These were not mere jobs. They were lifetimes of knowledge, crafts passed from parent to child, shaped by weather, soil, local folklore, and the needs of neighbors. Today, most of these crafts are gone, remembered only in fragments: a half-collapsed workshop, a rusted tool, a story told by someone whose grandparents once knew the last practitioner. But if we look closely, we can still trace the outline of a Britain built by hands that the modern world has forgotten. In the early mornings of rural England, long before the sun touched the tops of hedgerows, one of these figures stepped quietly through empty lanes: the village thatcher. With bundles of straw balanced across his back, he transformed rooftops into living structures, weaving each stem with a precision that kept families warm through harsh winters. Thatching was not decoration, it was survival. Every village relied on him, yet his craft demanded decades of learning. He understood how wind moved across valleys, how rain slid along angles of roofs, how fragile a home became without his skill. Today, only a few hundred thatchers remain, a whisper of a time when villages depended entirely on them. Across the fields, another craft shaped the rhythm of rural life: the wheelwrights trade. In a Britain dominated by carriages, wagons, and farm carts, a village could not function without perfectly balanced wheels. A wheelwright's workshop smelled of oak, iron, and sweat, his hands stained permanently dark from steam-bending wood. He was both engineer and artist, crafting wheels that had to survive miles of stone roads and unpredictable weather. His work was essential, yet unforgiving: a single miscalculation could splinter a wheel and end a journey. As roads evolved and machines replaced wooden carts, the wheelwright's hammer fell silent. Many of their workshops now stand empty, their walls holding a silence once filled with motion. But the heart of a village beat loudest in the forge. The blacksmith was more than a craftsman, he was the anchor of rural Britain. His fire shaped everything: horseshoes, tools, hinges, plow blades, lantern hooks, and locks. People visited the forge not only for work, but for news, advice, and warmth during cold evenings. A skilled blacksmith could repair nearly anything: he kept farms running and families safe. The glow of the forge once lit countless villages, but as industry rose and factories replaced handmade iron, the blacksmith's role dwindled. Today, only reenactments and rare hobbyists keep fragments of his world alive. As fields shifted with seasons, another figure walked among them: the hedge-layer, whose craft appears almost mythical to modern eyes. With practiced movement, he cut, bent, and wove living branches to form natural fences that could last for decades. These hedges protected livestock, marked boundaries, and shaped the look of the British countryside itself. Yet this craft required immense patience and intuition. No two hedges were the same, and the hedge-layer needed to understand the subtle personality of each tree and thorn. When wire fences arrived, quicker and cheaper, the art began to fade. But the landscapes these craftsmen shaped remain, living monuments to their forgotten skill. And in small cottages illuminated by winter lamps, another worker shaped village life: the lace-maker, whose fingers moved like water. Using bobbins of thread, she created patterns so delicate they seemed impossible. Lace-making was not just decoration, village families depended on it as a source of income. The sound of clicking bobbins once echoed in parlors across Britain. But when factories flooded the market with cheap lace, the craft withered, leaving behind only a few museums and the memories of women whose patience wove beauty from thread. These crafts, the thatcher, the wheelwright, the blacksmith, the hedge-layer, the lace-maker, formed the foundation of rural Britain. Their work held communities together in ways modern life barely remembers. And yet, their world was not merely practical, it was profoundly human, shaped by quiet rituals, unspoken cooperation, and an understanding of the land that no textbook could teach. As the centuries turned and Britain's rural landscape shifted under the pressure of industry, many traditional crafts survived only in the quiet corners of small villages, kept alive by people whose skills were shaped not by books, but by generations of observation. These crafts existed long before factories, long before machines, and each represented a language of survival that entire communities once depended on. The village wheelwright, for example, was not simply a maker of carts, he was an interpreter of wood. He knew which trees bent without breaking, which resisted moisture, and which sang with strength when struck in the workshop's dim morning light. A single cartwheel could take days to construct, each spoke carved by hand, each iron band measured to fit with exact precision. Travelers who passed through such villages rarely understood how much of the countryside relied on that quiet, rhythmic labor echoing from the wheelwright's shed. Further along the village lanes, the cooper's workshop smelled of oak, smoke, and sap. Barrels were more than containers, they were lifelines. Fishermen needed barrels for salted catch, farmers for grain, taverns for ale, and households for winter stores. A well-made barrel was a mark of trust, and the cooper knew that even a small imperfection could cost a family an entire season's worth of provisions. His work required strength and patience. Staves were shaped with practiced swings, then tightened with iron hoops heated over open flame. When a barrel cooled, the wood swelled naturally, forming a watertight seal. No nails. No glue. Just skill. Not far from these craft workshops stood the cottage of the village thatcher. In modern Britain, thatched roofs are admired for their beauty, but centuries ago they meant much more. Thatchers understood how to weave straw in a way that resisted storms and kept warmth inside during long winter months. They cut reeds from riversides, dried them in bundles, and layered them with careful precision. Each roof was a signature of the thatcher's work, carrying a blend of practicality and quiet artistry. And although storms often tore at the eaves and winter winds rattled the ridgelines, villagers trusted these roofs as deeply as they trusted the hands that built them. But one of the most emblematic crafts of old rural Britain belonged to the blacksmith. His forge glowed like a small sun at the heart of the village, flickering with sparks that illuminated the wooden beams above. In those days, the blacksmith was more than a craftsman, he was a problem solver, a healer of objects. He mended plows that fed families, shod horses that carried traders across long distances, repaired tools that kept homes functioning. Villagers knew that iron shaped by hand held a resilience no machine could replicate. And because his work touched nearly every household, the blacksmith often became a quiet confidant, a keeper of stories exchanged over the steady pulse of the hammer. Yet not all crafts were tied to heavy labor. Some were delicate, almost poetic in their execution. Lace makers gathered near windows where light was strongest, their fingers dancing over bobbins that clicked like soft music. The patterns they created were prized across the country, webs of thread that captured both patience and imagination. These women rarely saw the grand homes where their lace was worn, their world was a small wooden pillow, a handful of tools, and the rhythmic whisper of thread pulled taut. But their work traveled far, crossing borders and generations, becoming part of Britain's textile history. As rural villages became more connected to towns, many of these crafts slowly faded, not because they lost their value, but because machines worked faster, cheaper, and without rest. Yet fragments of these traditions lingered in cottages, workshops, and memories. Old tools hung above hearths long after their use had ended. Stories about the best wheelwright or the last great thatcher were told beside winter fires. And in this way, the crafts of old Britain never truly disappeared, they simply transformed into echoes, waiting to be remembered by those who still walk the narrow lanes where they were once practiced. As the centuries turned and Britain edged toward industrial change, the quiet work of its rural craftsmen began to fade, not suddenly, but like candlelight thinning against a rising dawn. In many villages, these crafts had been more than occupations. They were the rhythms around which life moved. Days were measured not by clocks, but by the sound of tools, the ringing of a cooper's hammer, the soft scrape of a thatcher's knife, the creak of a wheelwright's bench. These noises once shaped the identity of the countryside. But by the 19th century, they had become echoes, slowly slipping into memory. One of the most fascinating trades to vanish was that of the hedger and ditcher, a craftsman whose job was to tend the living boundaries of fields. Hedges were not simple bushes. They were carefully woven barriers that marked property lines, protected crops, and guided livestock. The hedger shaped them with quiet precision, weaving young shoots into tight patterns that grew stronger over years. To modern eyes, the work looks almost like art. But for centuries, it was vital to survival. Without hedges, farms were vulnerable to erosion, floods, and wandering animals. Yet when metal fencing arrived, villages no longer needed these patient caretakers of the landscape. The craft, once essential, slipped into obscurity. Equally evocative was the life of the charcoal burner, a solitary figure who lived for weeks in the woods tending slow-burning kilns. Charcoal was the lifeblood of rural Britain, fuel for ironworking, brewing, tanning, and blacksmithing. Burning it required skill and constant attention. Too much air, and the wood burned away to ash; too little, and it smothered. Charcoal burners slept in small huts beside their fires, waking through the night to add just vents or check the color of the smoke. Their world was defined by silence, embers, and patience. But as coal became widely available, their fires darkened, their huts emptied, and the craft disappeared almost overnight. Another lost profession, the reed thatcher, built the very roofs that sheltered rural families from wind and rain. Thatching was a skill of intricate movements, selecting reeds of equal length, binding them tightly, layering them at precise angles so rainwater slid cleanly away. A well-made thatched roof could last decades. But by the early 20th century, cheaper materials arrived, and many villages abandoned the craft. Only a handful of thatchers carried the tradition forward, preserving a skill that had once shaped the very skyline of the countryside. Then there were the rush gatherers, who harvested long river reeds to weave mats, floor coverings, and simple household items. These mats insulated stone floors from winter cold and were replaced seasonally as part of a communal ritual. But with industrial weaving and factory-made goods, rush collecting became unnecessary. The rivers continued to flow, but the people who once worked beside them vanished from the landscape. Perhaps the most emblematic of all vanished trades was the village wheelwright. His workshop sat at the center of nearly every rural settlement, filled with the smell of sawdust and the heavy scent of iron. He built everything from wagon wheels to plow frames, each piece crafted by hand, each joint shaped with a precision passed from father to son. Villages depended on him; without wheels, nothing moved. But factories changed everything. Machine-cut timber replaced hand-shaped oak, iron rims were mass-produced. One by one, wheelwrights closed their workshops, their benches left quiet, their tools untouched. And yet, even as these professions faded, traces of them remained, in the patterns of old hedgerows, in forgotten charcoal pits hidden beneath moss, in abandoned barns where thatchers once stored their reeds. These remnants are not simply relics of labor, they are the fingerprints of a country shaped by human hands. In their disappearance lies a story of transformation, how rural Britain slowly stepped out of an ancient rhythm and into a modern world, leaving behind the crafts that had sustained life for centuries. By the dawn of the 20th century, the quiet crafts that had once defined Britain's villages were beginning to slip into memory. Railways stitched the country together, factories rose in distant cities, and the slow, steady rhythm of rural life shifted permanently. Many of the old craftsmen who had shaped their villages for generations watched their trades fade as cheaper, manufactured goods replaced the work of hands that once held the landscape together. Yet even as these crafts vanished from daily life, they remained deeply woven into the identity of the countryside, echoes of a Britain built on patience, skill, and intimate knowledge of the natural world. Some of the last to disappear were the village wheelwrights. Their workshops, once filled with the sound of ringing metal and shaved oak, grew silent as motor vehicles replaced horse-drawn carts. Visitors described these shops as places where time itself seemed slower, dust illuminated by the glow of the forge, the smell of warm timber, the rhythmic tap of chisels shaping spokes. When the final wheelwrights closed their doors, they carried with them a skill no factory could replicate, the art of building something perfectly fitted to a living creature's pace. Rural glove makers vanished as well, leaving behind only fragments of their world. For centuries, small cottages hummed with the sound of needles pulling fine leather into elegant shapes. These gloves were not luxury items, they were companions to farmers, shepherds, and hunters who needed warmth and durability. The work required a sensitivity as precise as any modern craft, thin blades, soft hides, and hands steady enough to shape material that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. Today, such gloves exist only in museum drawers and attic chests, their makers unnamed but not forgotten. Village basket makers faced a similar fate. Their willow beds, once carefully tended near riverbanks, became overgrown as industrial containers replaced woven baskets. Yet these baskets had once carried everything: apples from orchards, fish from the coast, coal for winter hearths. Each village had its own style, shaped by the materials at hand: pale willow, dark hazel, or twisted heather. When these crafts faded, Britain lost more than objects. It lost a way of reading the land through materials that grew beside it. One of the most touching disappearances was the fading of rural thatchers. Though a few remain today, the craft has become rare. For centuries, thatchers shaped fields of straw into roofs that breathed with the seasons. They read the weather in the way a reed bent in the wind. A skilled thatcher could look at a cottage and know exactly how many bundles it required, where rain would gather, where wind would strike hardest. When metal and tile replaced straw, the countryside changed shape, losing a softness that had defined it for generations. With the disappearance of these crafts came the quiet fading of the people who practiced them. Their knowledge was rarely written, passed instead through gestures, demonstrations, and long hours of shared work. Their wisdom lived in memory, in touch, in repetition. And when the last of them passed, much of Britain's intangible heritage vanished with them. But memory has its own resilience. Today, small groups of historians, reenactors, and rural communities are bringing fragments of these crafts back to life. They demonstrate wheel-making at fairs, weave baskets along riverbanks, repair old thatched roofs, or teach children how to twist willow in the same patterns their ancestors once used. These revivals are not perfect recreations. They are acts of remembrance, echoes of a Britain that once relied on the patient motion of hands instead of machines. A Britain where every tool had a story, every object had a maker, and every craft was shaped by the landscape that surrounded it. If you would like to hear more atmospheric stories about forgotten Britain, make sure to subscribe to Old Britain Secrets and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these traditions alive.